At certain times in her history, economic, political, and other implications have forced Japan into armed conflict with neighboring countries. Although such action may be justified, the nature of war demands from the belligerent nation a high cost in human lives, the drainage of natural resources, and the judgment of God. Universal intimacy with the horrors of war makes it superfluous to discuss in detail the misery of the vanquished. However, recent history illustrates clearly that the victor also may lose far more than he gains from war. For large countries in an economically sound condition, damage usually is confined to relatively small areas, and the economy suffers but little. For a nation such as Japan, however, the damaging effects of only one major defeat in war may be so far-reaching and so profound that a subsequent series of victories will be unable to offset the damage incurred in the previous defeat. We feel that we can justify the thesis taught to the Japanese masses, whereby they were, subsequent to the Sino-Japanese and Russo-Japanese wars, led to believe that Japan would not and could not lose a war. Be that as it may, the military and political leaders in whose hands lies the future of a nation should concentrate their efforts on devising means not merely of winning a war, but of preventing defeat, should armed conflict prove inevitable. Should these national leaders be misled by the outward appearance of the armed might at their disposal, and throw their nation into the cataclysm of war without an exhaustive study of the implications of their actions, they cannot themselves escape the consequences of their acts. Their actions are nothing short of outrageous, or, in modern parlance, subversive, regardless of theoretical justifications. It has been the tragedy of modern Japan that those great and humane statesmen who attempted to follow the principles of fair play in international conduct often met death, and that several cabinets composed of such men fell by the wayside before the pressure of the military cliques. We, the Japanese, must never forget that it was criminal to permit this situation to exist, that because of this intolerable political blindness, we pushed millions of our good neighbours into misery and suffering beyond the comprehension of most Japanese civilians, and finally, that our own foolish actions hurled Japan into the present economic abyss from which she finds it so difficult to emerge. We must provide some form of compensation for those countries on which we have visited destruction. We must maintain the utmost vigilance to prevent the repetition of past mistakes. Despite this attitude, so necessary to peaceful international conduct, there arise occasions when armed might is indispensable to a nation's welfare. Those persons who have been invested with their nation's military responsibility must, without regard to politics, do their utmost to execute the duties entrusted to them. To meet its military requirements, a nation will strive for the most effective weapons and manpower. Several decades ago, Japan recognized adequate air power as the weapon most suited to solve its national defense problems, and accordingly stressed the growth of that arm, notably in the naval field. On July 7, 1937, the Sino-Japanese incident flared on the Asian mainland, almost a quarter of a century after we had undertaken to develop our naval air power. At this time, the Navy was prepared to counter any eventuality with this striking force. Carrier Striking Force, 1st Carrier Division under command of Rear Admiral Shiro Takasu, in Ryujo, Captain Katsuo Abe. 12 Type 95 carrier-based fighters, 15 Type 94 carrier-based dive bombers. Hosho, Captain Ryunosuke Kusaka, 9 Type 95 carrier-based fighter 6, Type 92 carrier-based attack bombers, 2nd Carrier Division. Under command of Rear Admiral Rokuro Hori in Kaga, Captain Ayao Inagaki, 12 Type 90, carrier-based fighter 12, Type 94 carrier-based dive bombers, 12 Type 89 carrier-based attack bombers, that's in 12. Type 96 carrier-based attack bomber land-based Air Force, 1st Combined Air Flotilla. Under command of Captain Michitaro Tozuka at Taipei, later Shanghai, Kisarazu Air Corps, Captain Ryuzo Takanaka. Type 95 land-based attack bombers. Type 96 land-based attack bomber Kanoya Air Corps, Captain Sizue Ishii, 9 Type 95 carrier-based fighters, 18 Type 96 land-based attack bombers, 2nd Combined Air Flotilla, under command of Rear Admiral Teizo Mitsunami at Omura, later Shanghai. 12th Air Corps, Captain Osamu Imamura, 12, Type 95 carrier-based fighter 12, Type 94 carrier-based dive bombers 12, Type 92 carrier-based attack bombers 13th Air Corps, Captain Sadatoshi Senda, 12, Type 96 carrier-based fighter, 12, Type 96 carrier-based dive bomber 12, Type 96 carrier-based attack bombers, total strength 66 carrier-based fighter, 51 carrier-based dive bombers 54, carrier-based attack bombers 48, land-based attack bombers 2118 combat-ready warplanes. There were also the 30 scout and observation seaplanes of the coastal defence ship Izumo, the flagship of the Third Fleet, stationed at Shanghai, the seaplane tender Kamoi, and various cruisers. When the fighting spread to Shanghai on August 13, 1937, our intelligence reported that the Japanese garrison in that city was completely encircled by a strong Chinese force, supported by 300 planes based in the Nanking area. Additional reports revealed that a concerted Chinese attack could in a few days wipe out to the last man the Japanese Marines who were isolated in Shanghai. The Marine garrison faced overwhelming numbers of Chinese troops. Since no airfield within Shanghai was usable, our men were denied local air coverage. On August 14th, following a series of sharp land battles, the Chinese planes opened bombing attacks against our forces in and around Shanghai. Even as the raids began, a single Type 90 scout observation seaplane of the Izumo attacked the enemy formations, downing one fighter. This first aerial battle forecast greater commitments of planes by both sides. On the evening of August 14th, the Type 96 land-based attack bombers, NELs, of the Kanoya Air Corps based at Taipei, Formosa, attacked Chinese positions. On the following day, NELs of the Kisarazu Air Corps from Omura Base on Kyushu Island began their bombing raids, and, commencing on the 16th, the carrier planes joined the rising tide of raids against the enemy's forces. These attacks of the Bells constituted the first transoceanic bombing raids. For many years, the Japanese Army and Navy had hidden their armament and weapons. The public saw only the obsolete models of heavy guns, warships, and planes. In contrast to this policy, other countries obviously attempted to frighten their enemies into submission through constant exhibition of their military forces. Knowledge of the true performance of foreign weapons was denied the public. The propaganda mills ground out exaggerated reports of the actual strength of each nation. By importing many foreign aircraft and weapons, we in Japan were able to gauge approximately what these weapons could and could not do. By keeping our planes and other armament within our borders and free from prying eyes, we led the world seriously to underestimate the combat strength of our naval aviation. The so-called transoceanic bombing missions of the Sino-Japanese incident revealed for the first time the actual capabilities of Japanese warplanes. The long-distance raids by the NEL bombers, averaging 2,000 kilometers, 1,250 miles, for each raid, exceeded by a considerable margin the previous maximum range attacks of any country's planes. Further appreciation of this startling advance in aerial warfare was possible when it was revealed that these airplanes were carrying out their attacks in extremely poor weather, flying from Formosa and Kyushu against targets in and around Shanghai, Nanking, Hanchu, and other cities. The elation which swept the Japanese populace with the announcements of the bombing was understandable. We had a powerful, long-range, fair and foul weather, day and night bombing force. Our planes constantly set new records. The only air battles fought across an appreciable expanse of water up to this time had been those undertaken in World War I across the Straits of Dover and its vicinity. Despite the obvious quality of our planes and the caliber of our pilots, the Navy's Air Force suffered heavy losses in the early days of the incident. There was much to be learned in the art of long-distance attack which could be acquired in peacetime, but the price which the Chinese exacted for these lessons was severe. We learned, almost at once and with devastating thoroughness, that bombers are no match for enemy fighter planes. We lost many men as this lesson was administered, including Lieutenant Commander Nitta, Air Group Commander, Lieutenant J.G. Umebayashi, and Ensign Yamanouchi of the land-based attack bomber groups, and other pilots well known in Japan. The planes of the aircraft carrier Kaga suffered disastrously. The 12 Type 89 carrier-based attack bombers, led by Group Commander Lieutenant Commander Iwai, left the Kaga on August 17th for a raid against Hangzhou. Bad weather prevented a rendezvous with an expected fighter escort, and near their target the bombers were attacked by a group of Chinese fighter planes. 11 bombers, including the commanders, were shot down. Lieutenant J.G. Tanaka managed to bring his bullet-riddled and crippled bomber safely back to the carrier. Otherwise, the fate of the attacking group would never have been known, and another bomber formation might have suffered a similar fate. Tanaka's report astonished the officers of the fleet, and immediate warnings were issued to all bomber groups to take special precautions against the defending Chinese fighters. We discovered that when our fighter planes provided escort to, over and from the target, such incidents did not occur. Comparing the shattered unescorted bomber groups with the relatively unharmed formations protected by fighters, the Navy reacted quickly. The Kaga was ordered to return immediately to Sasebo and receive a full complement of the new Type 96 carrier-based fighters, Claudes. Although the fighters had never flown in service operations from an aircraft carrier, the gravity of the situation warranted the risk of accidents. In early September, the 2nd Combined Air Flotilla, equipped with the powerful Claudes, returned to Shanghai. In the 2nd Combined Air Flotilla were Lieutenant Commander Okamura, Lieutenant Commander Genda, and Lieutenant Nomura, 3 of Japan's outstanding veteran fighter pilots. Later, they were joined by another combat veteran, Lieutenant Nango. The flotilla's first raid against Nanking on September 18th was followed by wave after wave of attacks, made chiefly with dive bombers and the powerful Claude fighters. The Chinese Air Force put up a desperate air defense, hurling fighters of international repute against the Mitsubishi fighter planes. Chinese pilots attacked the Claudes with such planes as the English Gloucester Gladiator, the American Curtiss 75, and the Russian N-15 and N-16 fighters. There was no doubt about the outcome of the protracted aerial engagements. From the outset, the Claudes proved their superiority in a series of air victories. Within 2 months of the initial attacks against the Chinese targets, the enemy's fighter planes disappeared from the arena. The last combat on December 2nd, when Lieutenant Nango's Claudes blasted 10 N-16s from the sky over Nanking, was a glorious victory. All through October and November, the Japanese people rejoiced at the brilliant combat successes of the Claudes, which battled numerically superior forces. The Chinese moved their airbase facilities to rear areas beyond the flight range of the marauding Mitsubishi fighter planes, establishing new headquarters at Nanchang in central China, about 335 miles southwest of Shanghai. Attacking their planes from Shanghai with Claude fighters required new tactics. Lieutenant Commander Genda, Air Staff Officer of the 2nd Combined Air Flotilla, proposed that the Navy set up special refueling bases close to the Chinese lines to be used by the fighters on their way to the enemy. Employing Type 95 land-based attack bombers as emergency transport planes, the Navy flew fuel and mechanics for the fighters into Kwang Airfield. Although occupied by the Japanese Army, the airfield was partially isolated, since the enemy still controlled the supply lines. Our fighter planes landed at Kwangte for refueling, then resumed their flights for the Nanching area. Those planes with sufficient fuel to return directly to Shanghai flew non-stop from the target area. The remainder, with short fuel reserves, made another stop at Kwangte. The novelty of the new tactics proved completely successful, as repeatedly our fighters made disastrous surprise raids against the unsuspecting Chinese. Japan gained a hero in this series of attacks. Flight Petty Officer Kashimura had just downed his 2nd enemy plane in a single engagement when the falling fighter rammed the Claude, shearing off more than 1/3 of its left wing. Through superb piloting, Kashimura managed to return his crippled fighter to Shanghai. The demands of battle forced the naval planes into unexpected situations for which they had not been trained. Carrier-based dive bombers, attack bombers, and Type 95 carrier-based fighters repeatedly reconnoitred, bombed and machine-gunned enemy forces in direct cooperation with our army units, which were advancing steadily westward from the Shanghai area to Nanking. Although lacking in training and experience, the naval pilots performed these missions so successfully that they received the greatest praise of the ground units, who benefited materially from their supporting attacks. These special operations were discontinued after 3 months of fighting, marked by the fall of Nanking. Many lessons were gained in the way of new tactics and operations from the campaign, especially air groups and combat planes trained at sea for sea duty can serve successfully without special training in any air campaign over land. The key to success in any land or sea operation depends upon command of the air. The outstanding combat successes of the Claude fighter planes ended a long-standing controversy in Japan, destroying once and for all the validity of the arguments of those who insisted upon retaining biplane-type fighters. Even with due consideration for its exceptional maneuverability, the short range and slow speed of the Type 95 carrier-based fighter doomed it to extinction. It required the final test of combat to determine which of these two fighter types would be the most effective in war. The China air battles vindicated completely the Navy's insistence upon the strictest training for all pilots and air crews. Although the naval pilots were trained specifically for operations against enemy surface fleets, their quality enabled them to perform with an efficiency superior to that exhibited by our Army pilots. Conversely, it was also determined that pilots trained specifically for maneuvers over land experienced great difficulty in overwater operations, even in merely flying long distances over the ocean. We discovered that the extended range of our Navy bombers opened new vistas of aerial warfare, and that with these far-flying aircraft we could attack enemy positions far behind the front lines or while several hundred miles at sea. Most important of all, perhaps, we learned that certain types of air campaigns could not be strictly defined as either strictly land or sea battles, but required of the pilots the ability to fight under any conditions. Despite these more obvious results of aerial warfare in China, the far-sighted younger officers of the Navy Air Force encountered a solid wall of conservatism among the military hierarchy. The situation within the Army proved similar. There was little change in the basic concept of air power as an auxiliary to sea and land forces. Aware that they must first overcome the obstacles of outmoded thinking before they could hope to modernize our aerial weapons, our naval air officers again bent every effort to obtain greater authority and increased funds for their air force. In the succeeding years, these efforts proved their worth. Modern equipment, better training, and increased numbers of planes gave the Navy the strength of modern air power. Despite radical changes within its own organization, the Army failed to keep pace with the constant and rapid advances in air power achieved by the Navy, and was especially deficient in general reliability and ground maintenance. Except for a few plane types such as the Type 100 headquarters plane, far superior to any comparable Navy aircraft, the performance of the Army's planes fell below those of its sister service. Despite vigorous attempts to modernize the Army's air training policies, it remained particularly deficient in overwater and night-flying capabilities. The Army Air Force never quite emerged from its position as the crippled Air Force, whose dominion was confined entirely to the land. Even as Japan drifted toward the Pacific War, men of foresight recognized the need for a land-based air power capable of operating under any conditions. These men, outside the military organization, failed in their efforts to convince the Army's leaders of their views. We have often wondered about this misfortune of Japan, whose particular military, political and social system did not permit the views of people outside the military hierarchy to affect the nation's armament. Certainly we could have done much to improve the effectiveness of our air strength had we at least listened. The war in China was now 3 years old. We temporarily discontinued military operations in Middle China, commencing with the occupation of Nanking in December of 1937. By the year's end, the Japanese government was making every possible effort to settle the regrettable conflict between Japan and China. The attempts at negotiation failed completely, due primarily to the interruption of the Japanese army hierarchy, as well as to the desire of influential Chinese parties to see the war continued. Indeed, in January 1938, army officers compelled Prime Minister Konoye against his will to announce, "We will not negotiate with the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek." The inevitable happened. The war continued, and no end appeared in sight. The Japanese people, concerned with the rapid spread of open fighting in China since July 7th of the previous year, still believed optimistically that despite the Prime Minister's obvious surrender to the army, the war would soon end. Several leaders of our country publicly warned the government of the foreseeable grave consequences of extended fighting with China. A number of patriots in and outside of government service openly opposed the influential army groups which, acting through the timorous Prime Minister, had so effectively diverted national policy and had committed the nation to war. These protests proved of little avail, as history relates. Thus the fighting spread rapidly, soon enveloping most of China. In January 1938, Japanese troops triumphantly concluded the Hankou operation. 13 months later, they controlled Hainan Island and also temporarily and successfully halted the Shanxi campaign. In the interim, our naval air units flew constant sorties, mainly in southern and central China. Once the Chinese air groups retreated beyond the range of the Type 96 carrier fighters to rebuild their shattered strength, the air war became a protracted struggle confined almost entirely to the bombing attacks of the Type 96 land-based attack bombers. Despite the best intentions of our commanders, the war situation demanded the presence of the naval air units at the Chinese front, a situation in which their maximum potentialities could not possibly be developed. Following their advance in late 1938 to the Hankou Air Base, the Navy Air Force flew close support missions for Army troops and Navy surface forces with Type 97 carrier attack bombers, Kates, and with Type 99 carrier dive bombers, VALs. The Type 96 land-based attack bombers, NELs, bombed Chongqing and other interior bases. The Type 96 carrier fighters, Claudes, defended our air bases and engaged enemy fighters whenever the Chinese pilots ventured within the range of the Claudes. Between May and September of 1939, the NELs attacked Chongqing from Hankou bases with 22 separate raids, aggregating an over-target total of 200 bombers. On November 4, 1939, NELs flew from the Hankou bases to attack Chengdu, and from late November to late December, the NELs flew from Yucheng bases in Shanxi to raid Lanqiao in Kansu. The continuous aerial assaults noticeably weakened the Chinese Air Force's offensive power. Despite the effectiveness of the attacks, however, within 6 months we noticed definite signs of recovery. From mid-May to early September of 1940, NELs repeatedly battered the Chongqing area. In the Hankou area in mid-1940, 130 Type 96 bombers were assigned to the 4 China-based Air Corps, Kanoya, Takao, the 13th and the 15th. Every flyable airplane flew in each mission against Chongqing for a total of 168 daytime attacks and 14 night raids, aggregating 3,117 bombers over target. These were the heaviest raids of the China Air War. On 8 raids, Army Type 97s joined the NELs, aggregating 72 planes over target. The limited range of the Claude fighters prevented them from escorting the bombers to their objectives, where waiting Chinese fighters pounced upon the raiders. We suffered heavy losses. 9 planes were destroyed or missing, and a total of 297 bombers were damaged. During some raids, the percentage of lost or damaged bombers rose beyond the prohibitive figure of 10%. The Chinese fighters inflicted at least half the damage sustained by our bombers, while anti-aircraft fire was responsible for the remainder. We could alleviate this unsatisfactory situation only by securing command of the air over the targets. The Zeros were the answer. With their 2 machine guns and 2 20mm cannon, they outgunned every airplane which opposed them. Their 300-mile-per-hour speed enabled them to pursue and to catch all enemy aircraft within their range. Combining the advantages of speed, rapid climb, excellent maneuverability, and heavy firepower, our pilots had in their new Zero fighter an airplane which shattered enemy opposition. Besides the 2 skilled squadron commanders, Lieutenants Tomotsu Yokoyama and Saburo Shindo, and other well-known fighter pilots including Lieutenant J.G. Ayao Shirane, Flight Warrant Officers Koshiro Yamashita and Ichiro Higashiyama flew with the new planes. On August 19, 1940, Lieutenant Yokoyama led a squadron of 12 Zero fighters on an escort mission of 50 Nell bombers over Chungking, but failed to encounter any Chinese fighters. The following day, Lieutenant Shindo made another sweep over Chungking, escorting 50 bombers, but again failed to find an opportunity to engage in combat. Our intelligence officers believed that the Chinese had already learned of the arrival of the Zeros in China and, accordingly, had carefully dispersed their planes. Despite the lack of action which our pilots coveted, the initial 2 combat flights proved valuable in that they enabled our pilots to become familiar with the combat area. The missions also established new world records for the combat flights of fighter planes. The Zeros flew a round trip of more than 1,000 nautical miles. By early September, the Navy concluded its major offensive and expeditionary operations and recalled from the continent all units except the 12th Air Corps, with Zero fighters, and the 13th Air Corps, with several squadrons of Nell bombers stationed in the Hankow area. On September 12th, Lieutenant Yokoyama led 12 Zeros on an escort mission for 27 Nells in an attack against Chungking. Unopposed in the air, the Zero pilots sighted 5 enemy planes on the ground at Shimachou airfield and dove earthward in a strafing attack. The enemy planes were decoys, and the Zeros then strafed airfield structures and other military establishments. Despite the lack of active aerial opposition against the Zeros, photographs taken the same day by a Type 98 reconnaissance plane confirmed the presence of 32 Chinese planes on the bases about the city. On September 13th, 13 Zeros under the command of Lieutenant Shindo and Lieutenant J.G. Shirane escorted Nell bombers from Hankow on the 35th raid of the 13th Air Corps against Chungking. After the bombing runs, the pilots put into effect a long-planned ruse to lure the Chinese fighters out of hiding. The Nells turned and started for Hankow, accompanied by the fighter planes. Approximately at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with our bombing force already out of sight of the city, our reconnaissance plane radioed Lieutenant Shindo that Chinese fighters had appeared over Chungking. The Zeros wheeled, climbing for altitude as they returned to the city and the unsuspecting Chinese fighters. Diving out of the sun, the Zeros swarmed over the startled Chinese pilots, spreading havoc with their machine guns and cannon. Within 30 minutes, our pilots cleared the sky of all the Chinese fighters, later identified as 27 Russian-made N-15 and N-16 airplanes. Japan gained a new hero in Flight Warrant Officer Koshiro Yamashita, who in this single combat became an ace by destroying 5 enemy fighters. Flight Petty Officer, Second Class, Oki, despite damage to his fuel tanks, pursued and destroyed an N-15 fighter. 2 desperately evading enemy planes smashed into and exploded against a mountainside. Utterly confused by the flashing, swirling Zeros, 3 Chinese pilots hastily bailed out of their undamaged fighters. With the last enemy plane cleared from the sky, Warrant Officer Yamashita and Petty Officers Kitahata and Yoneda flew to Paishihi airfield, strafing and burning several Chinese planes which were just returning from other missions. Our pilots were overjoyed. Only 4 Zeros suffered light damage, and every one of our pilots escaped injury. Vice Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, the Commander-in-Chief of the China Area Fleet, immediately dispatched a special commendation to the Zero Fighter Squadron, which stated, "Obviously, the inability of the Chinese pilots to present a determined front to the attacking Zero fighters accentuated by 2 crashing enemy planes and the 3 pilots who needlessly bailed out, contributed heavily to the one-sided victory of September 13th. Much of the credit, however, rested directly with the Zero fighter, which, by virtue of its superior flight range, staying power, high speed, heavy firepower, and unexcelled maneuverability, imparted to our pilots a tremendous advantage in dogfighting. This was enhanced, of course, by the superior flying ability of our pilots. Informed of the brilliant first combat success of the Zero fighters, Vice Admiral Teijiro Toyota, Chief of the Naval Bureau of Aeronautics, forwarded a letter of appreciation, reproduced below, to each of the 3 companies, Mitsubishi, Nakajima, and Dai Nihon Heiki, the Japan Weapons Company, which had manufactured the airframes, engines, and 20mm cannon. The Navy expressed its great satisfaction with its new fighter by granting the Nakajima Company a large production order for Zero fighter airframes. Encouraged by the success of the Zero fighters against the enemy planes over Chungking, later in the afternoon of September 13th, the 12th Air Corps launched the first attack against the city with Val bombers, flying from Yichang Air Base. 2 days later, Kate bombers also flew from Yichang to attack Chungking. With its newly won command of the air over the Chinese objectives, the Zeros made it possible for the Navy to apply all of its available bomber force against the enemy. On September 16th, 6 Zero fighters attacked and destroyed a single large Chinese plane over Chungking. This was their last combat engagement for the month. Our pilots and mechanics devoted the final 2 weeks of the month solely to maintenance, preparing for the forthcoming flights deep within enemy territory to where the Chinese planes had fled. Lieutenants Yokoyama and Shirane led 8 Zeros on an escort mission for 27 Nels of the 13th Air Corps in their first raid against Chengdu in Sichuan province. The 2 formations broke through thick clouds over the city at 2:30 p.m., and the bombers inflicted heavy damage on their targets. Unopposed in the air, the Zeros attacked nearby Taiping airfield, shooting down 5 N-16 fighter planes and 1 SB bomber. Our pilots then strafed airplanes and airfield installations. With ground facilities burning and Chinese personnel scattered from the field, Flight Warrant Officer Higashiyama and Flight Petty Officers Hagiri, Nakase, and Oishi landed on the field, while the remaining Zeros flew top cover. Leaving their planes with engines running, the 4 pilots attempted to set afire the remaining undamaged Chinese airplanes. The fierce gunfire of returning Chinese troops forced them to abandon their plan and take off immediately. The Zeros again had struck hard, shooting down 5 fighters and 1 bomber, burning 19 additional planes on the ground and damaging 4 others, for a total confirmed kill of 25 enemy planes destroyed. Only 2 Zeros received light damage. Again, Admiral Shimada forwarded a special commendation to the Corps. The following day, October 5th, Lieutenant Fusata Ida led 7 Zeros in strafing attacks against Fenghuangshan airfield near Chengdu. Our pilots set afire 6 large and 4 small planes and damaged 2 additional large aircraft. 14 decoys were burned. As a consequence of these attacks, the backbone of Chinese air strength in the Chungking and Chengdu areas was broken. For weeks afterward, the skies over these 2 cities were conspicuously free of enemy planes. Immediately prior to the initial combat successes scored by the Zero fighters, elements of our Army and Navy were enabled to advance into French Indochina as a result of diplomatic negotiations with the French Vichy government. Although our entry into French Indochina resulted from diplomatic political negotiations with France, this action eventually created strong friction between Japan and the United States, Great Britain, and other nations in the Allied fold. It could accurately be described as the first noticeable move in a series of events which finally resulted in the Pacific War. Our naval air units stationed in southern China flew immediately to their new bases in northern French Indochina. The proximity of these new stations to Chinese targets enabled us to launch single-engine bombers to attack Kunming, an area of great strategic importance in southwestern China, which previously could be reached only by the long-range Nels. As soon as the French air bases could receive them, squadrons of the 14th Air Corps' Claude fighters, Kate attack bombers, and Val dive bombers were transferred to their new facilities. The 12th Air Corps in Hankow detached one squadron of Zero fighters, transferring them to French Indochina for long-range escort work. On October 7th, 7 Zero and 9 Claude fighters escorted a group of Val dive bombers to Kunming. Nearly 20 enemy fighter planes opposed the Zeros and Claudes, which definitely destroyed 13 enemy planes and probably destroyed another. The Vals wrecked 4 enemy planes on the ground. On December 12th, 7 Zero fighters escorted 10 dive bombers and 2 bomb-carrying reconnaissance planes in an attack against Changyun. Our fighters strafed and destroyed 22 enemy planes on the ground. From October 8 to the end of December, Zeros flew an additional 22 sorties, in which they definitely shot down 2 enemy planes. While the Indochina-based planes attacked southern Chinese targets on October 10th, the Double 10 Festival Day of China, the 12th Air Corps Zeros in the Hankow area raided Chongqing without encountering enemy opposition. On October 26th, 8 Zeros caught a large group of Chinese planes over Chengdu, destroying 5 enemy fighters, 1 transport plane, and 4 other types. On December 30th, 8 Zeros returned to Chengdu for their 4th attack, sweeping in a strafing attack over the Fenghuangshan, Taiping-Su, Shuanglin, and Wenqiang airfields. They burned 18 enemy planes and wrecked 15 others by cannon fire. The Zeros also set afire 1 large fuel storehouse and shot up other ground installations. Only 2 of our fighters suffered damage from anti-aircraft fire. Thus ended the year 1940 and the Zero fighters' baptism in combat. It drew first blood in an almost miraculous fashion, for in the period from August 19th to the end of the year, the Zeros ran up this record. Number of attacks made, 22 total number of planes used, 153 Chinese planes shot down, 1 probable, 59 Chinese planes destroyed, air and ground, 101 number of Zeros damaged by enemy fire, 13 number of Zeros lost, 0. However brilliant these combat successes, and however outstanding the record of our Navy Air Force in China, from the first transoceanic bombing of 1937 to the close of 1940, our pride can be justified only from the military standpoint. No Japanese citizen can recall the events of these years and find justification for the national conduct of our country. No one can deny the record, for history will relate only that Japan forced her friendly neighbouring nations into an unreasonable and unnecessary war, transformed their fields and cities into battlegrounds, and visited misery and deprivation on millions of innocent people. As Japanese, we find it difficult and more than a little embarrassing to discuss in retrospect our military successes in China immediately prior to the Pacific War. We would prefer to relegate our nation's inexcusable conduct in the Sino-Japanese incident to oblivion. However, in order to accurately present certain phases of that incident not previously included in this book, I, Okumiya, must review a certain aspect of these events. In late October of 1940, the Navy recalled from China all its Type 96 land-based attack bombers, NELs, for reorganization into new combat units. During the 6 months from October to April of 1941, the Zero fighter planes remaining on the continent were the only aerial forces capable of attacking on all fronts the Chinese units, which had retreated beyond the effective range of our single-engine bombers and our Claude fighters. The task assigned to the remaining groups was enormous, for they were equipped with only 30-odd fighter planes. Nevertheless, the Zeros maintained their one-sided superiority over enemy aircraft and, on March 14, 1941, scored another tremendous victory when our fighters slashed into large Chinese formations over Chengdu. Our pilots destroyed 24 planes and probably destroyed 3 others. In May of 1941, several units of Type 96 and Type 1 twin-engine bombers returned to China to resume heavy bombing operations, which augmented the marauding raids of the Zero fighters. On May 20th, unable to ferret out Chinese fighters over Chengdu, the Zeros strafed and set afire fuel storage installations and destroyed 2 planes on the Taiping's and Shuanglin airfields. This strafing raid, however, marked the end of the incredible good fortune of the Zeros against enemy opposition. Anti-aircraft fire riddled Chief Flight Petty Officer Kimura's airplane, which subsequently crashed. This was the first Zero lost in combat. 3 other fighters sustained damage from enemy ground fire that day. On May 22nd, 19 Zeros attacked Chengdu, shooting down 2 enemy planes and burning 10 on the ground in strafing attacks. 5 Zeros were damaged. Nanchang was visited next. On May 26th, 9 Zeros destroyed 5 out of 20 Chinese fighters in aerial combat and then burned 18 additional planes in strafing runs. 20 Zeros raided Lanzhou on the 27th, but failed to arouse the enemy pilots. They burned 2 planes on the ground. On June 7th, 4 Zeros caught 2 Chinese fighters over Chongqing, blasting 1 from the air. 22 Zeros made the biggest attack in months on the 18th against Lanzhou, but failed to encounter enemy planes. They strafed and burned 2 planes and suffered damage to 2 Zeros. On the 22nd, 9 of our fighters raided Chengdu, burning 1 plane and damaging another in a low-level sweep. On the same day, 6 Zeros swept over Kanyuan, catching at least an equal number of Chinese fighters in the air and destroying 3 of these. Later that afternoon, the day's 3rd long-range patrol raided Tianshui. 7 Zeros shot down 1 enemy plane. On the 23rd, 6 Zeros strafed Ep.1, burning 2 and damaging 5 additional planes. We lost our 2nd Zero later in the day on the 23rd. 3 fighters escorting 2 Type 98 reconnaissance planes on a low-altitude flight between Lanzhou and Yuncheng were caught suddenly by a heavy anti-aircraft barrage, causing pilot Kobayashi's Zero to crash. Subsequently, for more than 2 weeks, our fighters searched in vain for enemy planes. The Chinese refused to give battle. On August 11th, however, 16 Zeros escorting 7 Type 1 bombers over Chengdu swarmed over a large group of Chinese fighters, which for the first time in weeks opposed our bombers. 3 enemy planes flamed before the Zero's cannon, and the bombers destroyed 2 others. The attack proved successful. The bomber raid against enemy airfields destroyed 7 planes on the ground and damaged an additional 9. On August 31st, the Zeros embarked on their most difficult and final mission of the war in China. Their target was Songfan, China's northwesternmost stronghold, which lay some 500 nautical miles west of our Yuncheng base. Towering mountain ranges of 23,000 feet jutted into the ever-present clouds along the route which our planes must follow. Since the beginning of the Sino-Japanese incident, Songfan had been attacked but once. In June, Mahiro Air Corps bombers raided the stronghold. 2 Type 98 land-based reconnaissance planes led 5 Zero fighters, each flown by one of our best pilots in China, against the distant target. The planes met the expected heavy cloud cover and managed to maintain formation by flying at different heights where clearer air beckoned. Finally, the cloud masses almost completely filled the visible sky, forcing the 7 airplanes to turn back. The Zero's role in China was completed. From early 1941 to September of the same year, Zeros flew 354 sorties, during which they shot down 44 enemy planes and damaged 62. During this same period, we lost 2 fighters to anti-aircraft guns, while 26 suffered damage both from enemy planes and from ground fire. The battle score for the Zeros in all engagements on the Chinese mainland totaled 70 attacks against enemy targets, during which an aggregate of 529 fighters participated. They shot down 99 planes and probably shot down 4 others, while damaging an additional 163 planes. 39 Zeros sustained damage, and enemy ground fire destroyed 2. The largest single attack was a raid by 30 fighters on May 20, 1941, against Chengdu. Zero fighter groups received 5 letters of commendation from the Commander-in-Chief of the China Area Fleet, awarded for meritorious accomplishments in the missions against Chongqing on September 13, 1940, against Chengtu on October 4 and December 30, 1940, against Chengtu on March 14, 1941, and against Nanjing on May 26, 1941. By March of 1941, the land-based attack bomber groups, which had returned to Japan for reorganization, were ready for new assignments. In early April, the Genzan and Mihiro Air Corps of the newly organized 22nd Air Flotilla returned to central and north China. They were joined in late July by the Kanoya and the 1st Air Corps of the 21st Air Flotilla, and by the Takao Air Corps of the 23rd Air Flotilla. Escorted by Zero fighters, these bombers repeatedly attacked the cities of Chengtu, Chongqing, and Lanzhou. The Navy ordered the 3rd Air Corps of the 23rd Air Flotilla to northern French Indochina, from which the bombers raided Kunming. In late August and early September of 1941, their missions accomplished, the China-based bombers reported to new stations in both Japan and Formosa. During their second combat tour of 4 months, we placed 2,600 bombers over enemy targets. Of this number, we lost only 1 bomber, and that airplane fell to enemy anti-aircraft fire. In the dozens of raids which the bombers carried out, they encountered only 10 Chinese fighter planes which managed to slip past the escorting Zero fighters. Even so, the enemy fighter planes failed to destroy any of our planes. These facts clearly demonstrate Zero's effectiveness in the China campaign. Where once we had reached the point of prohibitive bomber losses to enemy fighters and anti-aircraft, the arrival of the Zeros entirely destroyed the enemy planes' effectiveness as interceptors. In summation, the Zero gave us undisputed command of the air over both our own territory and that of the enemy. By now, of course, we recognized the imminent possibility of a major war in the Pacific. The Navy completely reorganized its combat forces and alerted all units for possible immediate war. We intensified our training program, concentrating on those tactics most likely to be needed in a war of major scope. The long combat missions in China proved of immense value in reforming our frontline groups, for in Asia we had flown both day and night missions with large formations, coordinated closely operations between our escort fighters, attack bombers, and reconnaissance planes, improved our planes as dictated by the lessons of battle, effected fighter sweeps, and increased greatly the efficiency of our bombers and fighters. We felt that even with the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean as the next area of battle, the lessons we had learned from combat in China would prove their value. By late November of 1941, with the special 3-month period of intensive training completed, all the Navy's air units were fully prepared for battle, confident in their men, their planes, and their ground support groups. War, however, is seldom a one-sided affair. Despite our brilliant successes in China, we felt uneasy about a mass conflict with the United States and England. The vast strength of those two powers destroyed any basis for optimism. We knew that in a war against those two nations, we would face an array of weapons terrifying both in quality and in quantity. It must be admitted that this appraisal of a potential conflict with America and England was made only by few people within the Navy. The vast majority of our airmen, experienced only in combat against the Chinese, or basing their conclusions on reports of the China incident, could only visualize victory against any possible opponent. This completes the formatting of the provided text. Let me know if there's anything else you need. At midnight today, the 8th of December, our Army and Navy have opened hostilities with American and British forces. This totally unexpected broadcast on the early morning of December 8, 1941, struck the Japanese people like a thunderbolt. Bewilderment and open disbelief greeted the words of the announcer. It was true, of course, that the populace realized that diplomatic relations between their country and the United States were strained. The political maneuverings of the two countries since the summer of 1940 had been clouded by uncertainty and oppressiveness, partly due to the American government's freezing of Japanese assets in the United States and to the sudden suspension of the commercial treaty between the two nations. The public had little understanding of the actual deterioration of international relationships and found it difficult to accept an announcement of total war. However, the subsequent broadcast of the imperial rescript of the declaration of war left little doubt. The Japanese people soon concerned themselves with domestic adjustment as their nation plunged into war with two of the world's greatest powers. Our people faced an enigmatic situation. They had been led into war with little preparation for an impending major conflict. Despite national pride, no one could deny the awesome combined strength of the United States and Great Britain. The great majority of our people tried, anxiously and unsuccessfully, to evaluate their situation. Their desire to criticize bitterly the autocratic government, which without warning had swept the nation into war, was countered by the tendency to place full support behind that government, in the hope that the war had been undertaken with some plan for avoiding any physical destruction to the homeland. Only time would provide the answer. On December 8th, I, Okumiya, was Air Staff Officer of the 11th Combined Air Flotilla, with headquarters at Kasumigaura, in charge of training the pilots and other aircrew members for the Navy. The sudden announcement of war complicated my training program, which, I realized, would soon require considerable expansion. The experience of the Sino-Japanese incident and the recently completed 3-month period of intensive flight training meant that the Navy was well prepared to engage in limited operations with the enemy. However, our experience in large-scale conflict was insufficient for us to hold any confidence in our ability to maneuver against our opponents. The British, meanwhile, already had experienced nearly 2 years of war in Europe. America's military forces, while not yet actually engaged in open conflict, studied closely the lessons of the European battle and modified their own military organizations accordingly. This experience would improve the position of our enemies, giving them an advantage in addition to their numerical superiority in military aircraft and in material. At best, our expeditions in China were of limited usefulness. We lacked battle experience against strong enemy air forces. We enjoyed one distinct strategic advantage. The air war in China had taught us clearly that the key to any successful military operation lay in command of the air. Without effective air control, our sea and land forces would at best be placed in disadvantageous positions, and indeed might even forfeit victories which they could otherwise attain with adequate air power. It was also obvious, from past experience, that the primary means of attaining the coveted command of the air was through the possession of a superior fighter plane. Neither did we entertain any doubts that, in any large-scale protracted war in which planes and warships played the dominant roles, the outcome would depend largely on the basic national economy and our industrial potential. The secret document, Japanese Navy Wartime Organization Table, of which I was assigned a copy, listed the front and second-line naval air strength at the war's outset. From the preceding lists, I drew up a table of total aircraft types which would assist me in determining pilot and aircrew training program requirements, which stated, in the first-line striking force, all carrier-based dive bombers were Type 99s. Carrier-based attack bombers were Type 97s. 2-seat Scout Observation Seaplanes were Type 95 and Type Zeros. 3-seat Scout seaplanes were Type Zeros and some Type 94s, and all flying boats were Type 97s. Since we required 2 pilots to man each land-based attack bomber, flying boat, and transport plane listed in the above category, we needed a minimum of 3,500 pilots merely to operate the Navy's regular aircraft strength. This figure increased with the pilots required for the Navy's auxiliary aircraft, which numbered 1/3 the total of first and second-line forces. At the very least, then, we required a total of nearly 5,000 pilots and an equal number of observers, navigators, gunners, bombardiers, radio men, and other aircrew personnel to maintain operational status with existing planes. We realized that the war with the United States and England would drain Japan's limited resources, and that such attrition would create tremendous problems in the steady replacement of planes and material. I was fully aware, however, that our greatest weakness lay not in physical supplies or in bulk manpower, but in the steady replacement of qualified flight crews. The difference between the veteran flyer and the new pilot is far greater than is generally realized. One might compare the two to a man and a child. When I assumed my position in January of 1940 as an instructor at the Kasumigaura Training Air Corps, I learned that, despite the seeming low number of less than 3,500 naval pilots, we actually maintained in active service a greater number of pilots than did the American Navy. At that time, I was approached by Lieutenant Takekatsu Tanaka, my division officer, who felt concern for what he believed would surely be a future shortage of competent pilots. Far-sighted and capable, and deeply concerned with the well-being of the Navy, Tanaka prepared and submitted to me for study his proposed Plan for Training 15,000 Pilots. Tanaka's work and able consideration of training problems so impressed me that I forwarded the report with favourable recommendations to my immediate superior. In comparison to the then-existing Navy pilot training program, however, the number of pilots Tanaka proposed to train each year was so great that my superiors dismissed the recommendation merely as the wild dream of a young Air Force officer. It is regrettable that the dream was not afforded the attention it deserved. In August of 1941, when I was appointed as an air staff officer at Kasumigaura, the Navy circulated a new mass training program which called for the special training of 15,000 pilots. World events and the demands placed upon our naval air units had changed so rapidly that accurate predictions became impossible. The Navy's new training program came too late. It was impossible to train effectively the flight crews demanded by the Navy in the short space of time allowed. On that fateful morning of December 8, 1941, I felt that it was more than likely that, either quickly or through attrition, our shortage of pilots would result in victory for the United States and England. The mathematics were simple. Numerically, the Navy's trained flight crews, i.e., those who had received operational on-the-job service following a year's preliminary training, could not possibly man all the regular service aircraft listed in the Japanese Navy wartime organization table, which I studied. Obviously, the greater majority of those pilots who were assigned to the spare planes were those who lacked even a full year's training within the Combat Air Corps. The overall figures hid further deficits in our manpower. Many of our veteran pilots, then assigned to frontline combat units, could not possibly withstand the rigours of actual combat. A combination of age and ill health would effectively further reduce our ranks even before hostilities commenced. I realised intuitively that the percentage of pilots who lacked sufficient training, already a problem at the very outset of the war, would rapidly increase. We would not feel the effect of the proposed mass training program for at least another 2 to 4 years. At the end of the first week in December of 1941, the Navy's required training periods for student non-commissioned officer pilots were as follows. The Navy selected its Air Force officers from its lieutenants, JG and ensigns, training these men for at least 12 months. These students were regarded as adequate pilots following a year of preliminary flight training in the Combat Air Corps, but they required at least 1 additional year of training to qualify as carrier-based pilots and forward combat area pilots. We maintained the strictest requirements for these young men, for, despite their age, they were responsible for the operation of elaborate and expensive machines and apparatus, of which Japan was continually in short supply. Once in the air, they were literally on their own. They must be fully competent to fulfill the responsibilities with which they had been entrusted. Time and again this policy proved its worth, notably so in the excellent performance of our pilots during the Sino-Japanese incident. The large-scale air battles of the Sino-Japanese incident and of the first 2 years of World War II in Europe were fought chiefly over the land areas of the Asian and European continents. Because there did not exist any proof of the effectiveness of bombing planes against large warships at sea, at the time of the Hawaiian operation on December 8, 1941, Our Navy backed its confidence in the superiority of the warship against any other type of armament. The proponents of maximum surface fleet strength pointed out the indecisiveness of mass aerial attacks against enemy objectives even on land, and further stressed the fact that the battles we could expect in the vast regions of the Southwest Pacific would be determined primarily by the performance of our sea and land forces. They stipulated that air units would obviously be relegated to support roles. They further strengthened their arguments by employing as the classic example the case of the German dreadnought Bismarck, which, despite the superiority of British naval air power, was destroyed mainly by the shells and torpedoes of numerous British warships. Despite the overwhelming argument of current history which favoured surface power, there were in our Navy a sufficient number of far-sighted officers who realised the potentialities of the bombing plane. Accordingly, the Navy exerted every possible effort to ensure the maximum efficiency of all available bombing units. This effort received further impetus when in mid-1941 the American government froze the assets of all Japanese residing in the United States. This move clarified the general drift toward a war between the two great powers, and our Army and Navy officers discussed privately the conflict which must inevitably flare between Japan and the United States and Great Britain. The vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean showed clearly that a war with these two foreign powers would be most likely decided upon the open sea. In the fall of 1941, our Army lacked aircraft capable of bombing from any base under our control the vital British installations at Singapore and similar American installations at Manila. Nor did the Army have any fighter planes which, operating from our southernmost base in Formosa, could raid the American airfields on Luzon. Occupation of the Singapore and Manila installations was vital to any extension of Japanese control in the Pacific. Consequently, as in the case of our operations in Central and South China in the early months of the Sino-Japanese incident, the Navy was assigned the responsibility for supplying air support for our ground forces. By their very nature, the United States and Great Britain were formidable adversaries in the air. We realized fully that, unlike the chaotic misuse of air power by China, America, and England, long our seniors in aviation and the two greatest international sea powers would employ their fighters and bombers with maximum efficiency. We expected only light resistance from enemy aviation at the outset, for we knew that only limited numbers of fighters and bombers were in the Orient in late 1941. This fact, however conducive to immediate Japanese successes, could not be regarded as an accurate appraisal of enemy air potential. We knew only too well that the two countries would quickly multiply by many times their Oriental complements of planes and men. Despite our enemy's awesome industrial might, the Navy had confidence in the ability of our Zero fighter planes to wrest air control from the enemy over any battle area. Our intelligence and our technical groups stated flatly that the excellent performance and technical superiority of the Zero fighter meant that, in battle, one Zero would be the equal of from 2 to 5 enemy fighter planes, depending upon the type. Because of this unshakable faith in the Zero, the Navy felt extremely confident of victory in initial campaigns. We expected, however, severe losses to our Type 1 land-based attack bombers, which constituted our major aerial striking forces. Where the Zero clearly could best any known enemy fighter, we realized that each bomber would be grounded for extensive repairs after 2 or 3 missions. The fuel tanks of the Type 1 bombers were not of the self-sealing or bulletproof types, and their repair was extremely difficult. I agreed that we might achieve outstanding initial combat success against America and England. The prospects of victory dimmed rapidly, however, in the face of a prolonged war in which the United States could bring to bear upon our forces its great industrial force. Attrition would cripple our strength just as effectively as enemy guns. During the summer of 1941, Army and Navy staff officers frequently discussed with government officials the possible ramifications of a war against the United States and England. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, fully realized the difficulties we would face in an extended struggle. cognizant of the almost insurmountable problem of maintaining and increasing qualified flight crews and supplying minimum numbers of combat planes to the front, Admiral Yamamoto frankly informed Premier Konoye, "If you tell me that it is necessary that we fight, then in the first 6 months to a year of war against the United States and England I will run wild, and I will show you an uninterrupted succession of victories. I must also tell you that, should the war be prolonged for 2 or 3 years, I have no confidence in our ultimate victory." Soon afterward, at the Imperial Council immediately prior to the decision to enter war, Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai stated to the Assembly that, "At all cost, we must avoid the war with the United States and Great Britain, which means a sudden deterioration in our national situation. We can afford the risk of gradual loss of our national political and economic situation." Ex-Premier Yonai's advice, supported by many high-ranking naval officers and civil officials, provided an excellent summation of the actual pre-war situation. Admiral Yamamoto, however, not only properly evaluated the excellent chances for initial Japanese military success, but also foresaw with foreboding clarity the inevitable defeat which lay ahead. High naval staff officers realized fully the pitfalls in the way of maintaining effective strength against the enemy, and emphasized that the war would of necessity be fought mainly at sea. Despite the apprehensions of these officers, who commanded the air combat units which would spearhead the proposed mass attack against American and English forces, the Imperial Council decided in favor of war. The Navy's past experience in testing foreign planes enabled us to evaluate accurately the performance of these aircraft we would be most likely to encounter in the opening phases of the war. Equally important, however, was the foreign evaluation of our military aircraft, and in this respect we enjoyed an undisputed advantage. Our potential enemy was sadly misinformed as to the true performance capabilities of our warplanes, and American aviation magazines especially went to great lengths to deride our air forces. Clearly they dismissed as inconceivable the possibility that Japanese planes could effectively carry the war to the Americans and the British. In September of 1941, the authoritative American magazine Aviations, in an article titled "Japanese Air Force," stated that our military and civilian pilots suffered from the world's highest accident rate, and that our Army and Navy trained fewer than 1,000 pilots each year. We could not help but wonder at the source of the magazine's information when we read that our pilots definitely were inferior in the Sino-Japanese incident to Chinese pilots, and that in the campaign at Nomonhan, Manchuria, the Soviet Air Force defeated our combat units. The magazine continued in this pompous fashion to state that while our Air Force was aggressive, it lacked experience in such large-scale operations as were being conducted in Europe. We could not hope, claimed the anonymous authority, ever to develop effective air power. The story ended on the note that our industry could not possibly meet the requirements of a war, that our aviation engineering depended entirely upon the handouts of the United States, Great Britain, Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union, and finally that America's aviation experts can say without hesitation that the chief military airplanes of Japan are either outdated already or are becoming outdated. The magazine's observations reflected not merely this single publication's views, but rather the international evaluation of Japanese military air power. It is true that to foreign observers our training methods may have appeared unduly reckless with regard to student casualties in a program which suffered from an insufficient number of training planes. Unknowingly, however, the magazine paid our military services an excellent compliment, for we had long bent every effort to conceal from foreign observation our actual military strength. In this respect, we were obviously most successful. Our Navy's chief training grounds were not in the homeland, but far at sea, where even our own people remained unaware of the true extent of air-sea manoeuvres. Further, we concealed in every possible fashion the particulars of our military weapons and especially the performance of our aircraft. Foreign observers saw only what we allowed them to see. So effective was our armaments censorship that prior to the Pearl Harbor attack, not a single American publication realized the existence of the Zero fighter, and not until several months following the opening of hostilities did the American public receive even a reasonably accurate impression of this airplane. Again, we determined the trend of American thought by observing in another magazine, published several months before December of 1941, that the Japanese Navy's Air Force consists of 4 aircraft carriers with 200 planes. In his Memoirs, Winston Churchill testified to the effectiveness of our military censorship and to the erroneous impressions of our air power held both by England and America. Referring to the Battle of Malaya fought on December 10, 1941, during which our planes sent to the bottom the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, Churchill defended the actions of Vice Admiral Sir Tom Phillips, who dispatched the ships under his command to the sea off Kuantan without fighter plane cover. On the basis of all data available to Admiral Phillips, Saigon, the Japanese base nearest to Kuantan, lay more than 400 nautical miles to the north, and the Admiral had every reason to believe that no torpedo bomber then in existence could carry out a mission over this distance. Admiral Phillips was, of course, in error, as we demonstrated so clearly by destroying the 2 mighty battleships. As Churchill himself stated, both England and America greatly underestimated the battle capabilities of our warplanes. This contributed greatly to the success of our operations. The unforgivable error of underestimating the enemy made by the Americans and the British was perhaps best illustrated in the reliance placed upon the antiquated Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighter plane, which American aviation experts boasted was the most powerful fighter plane in the Orient, and a fighter plane far superior to anything in the Japanese Air Force. Against the Zero fighters, the Buffalo pilots literally flew suicide missions. On the first day of the war, we jammed the message rooms, anxiously awaiting the initial combat reports which would inform us of initial victory or of setbacks. Our exuberance rose steadily as an unending stream of radio messages described the courageous and amazing victories won by our naval air units. My apprehension faded with the increasing number of reported victories. Incredibly, the first hours of war were totally in our favour. The evening of December 8th, Commander Ikegami, the senior staff officer of our air flotilla, returned from Navy General Headquarters in Tokyo with detailed combat reports. From these, we learned that Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the 1st Air Fleet's task force of 376 planes, 108 Zeros, 126 Type 99 dive bombers, and 142 Type 97 carrier-based attack bombers, which attacked the Hawaiian Islands, and that the Navy land-based Air Force of 566 planes, 224 Zeros, 288 Type 1 and Type 96 land-based attack bombers, 30 Type 99 land-based reconnaissance planes, and 24 Type 97 flying boats, of the 11th Air Fleet under Vice Admiral Nishizo Tsukahara, was in the Malayan and Philippines theatres of operations, flying from bases in Formosa, southern French Indochina, and Palau. Coordinating their attacks with Admiral Tsukahara's forces and the 4th Carrier Division under Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuda operating in the Davao area, the planes of Rear Admiral Eiji Goto's 24th Air Flotilla flew from their Marianas and Marshall Islands bases to lash out at Wake and Guam. Without exception, every combat report recorded only smashing victories. Our successes exceeded by far even the most optimistic pre-attack estimates. In all military history, I do not know of any country which simultaneously launched so many battles of such magnitude, and, in addition, so completely defeated its opponents as we did on that fateful morning of December 8, 1941. We coordinated our combat operations across a distance of 6,000 nautical miles, spanning the ocean between Hawaii and Singapore. What I would like history most to record, however, is that this abrupt reversal of the Asiatic-Pacific balance of power was accomplished with the total of only approximately 1,000 planes of the Japanese Naval Air Force, and that this same force suffered only the barest minimum of losses. An excellent evaluation of our available naval air power may best be had by referring to the air strength hurled by the Allies against Europe in the Normandy invasion. More than 11,000 aircraft. The initial anxiety of the Japanese people changed to wild joy when they learned of our astonishing military gains. Our own Air Force personnel jubilantly cheered each new message of conquest. To be perfectly honest, I personally was astounded at the enemy's inexplicably weak resistance. We expected our forces to fight hard and to achieve a certain minimum of successes, but prior to the attack, no one would have dared to anticipate the actual results of our initial assaults. Despite our brilliant gains, however, I and several other senior officers with a more intimate knowledge of the long-range consequences of the new war could not help but harbour anxiety as to the future of our nation. I remember clearly the special reactions of our young officers, who clamoured for combat duty. The war was hardly more than a month old when rumours spread among the personnel of the air flotilla that before long the war would end in a smashing victory for Japan. Front-line duty appealed much more to these young pilots than did the prosaic training duties of the home air flotillas, and they thought of nothing but their own participation in air battles. We could not disabuse these over-enthusiastic youngsters of their belief that the war would end too quickly for them to try their mettle against the enemy. We stressed the tremendous industrial potential of our adversaries, but with no effect. Our junior pilots were fully convinced that the war would end too soon to enable them to participate. The Pearl Harbor attack, overwhelming victory as the war begins. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a military feat so daring and so successful as to deserve a special place in history. In a single masterful stroke, Japan not only launched the opening phase of the Pacific War, but wrought mass devastation through the powerful American fleet, which was caught unaware in the Hawaiian Islands. The success of this attack stemmed directly from the brilliant planning and the decisive measures taken by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, who for the 18 years prior to the Pacific War had, with a fervour amounting almost to religion, devoted all his efforts to the end of creating a powerful Japanese naval air force. When our intelligence tabulated the final results of the Hawaiian operation, this was its official designation, we discovered that the surprise attack had inflicted far greater damage to the American warships in Hawaii than our most optimistic advance estimates had anticipated. The crippling of a large and powerful segment of the American fleet placed Japan's naval units in a position of strength sufficient to permit our rapid movement elsewhere throughout the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The great majority of Americans will undoubtedly be surprised to learn that the Pearl Harbor assault was not intended to be a sneak blow, although it has come to be accepted in the public mind as such. The conditions and timing of the attack, as related to diplomatic activities conducted simultaneously in Washington, D.C., unhappily created a situation in which it appeared our Navy deliberately struck without any prior notice of hostilities. This unfortunate eventuality occurred despite the fact that the Japanese government had forwarded an ultimatum to the United States through the Japanese embassy in Washington. Although the ultimatum was dispatched to the embassy in sufficient time to permit translation and delivery to the State Department prior to the actual attack, the Japanese embassy's inexcusable delay in making the translation resulted in delivery of the message after our planes had commenced their attack. Actually, this statement does not embody any unusual revelation, since the truth has already been revealed during the international war criminal trials at Tokyo. The writer wishes, however, to set the record straight in these pages. The Hawaiian operation was carried out under the direct command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who was given command of a special carrier task force for the Pearl Harbor operation. The attacking fleet was composed of 23 vessels, including 6 aircraft carriers. These were the Akagi and the Kaga of the 1st Carrier Division, the Soryu and the Hiryu of the 2nd Carrier Division, and the Zuikaku and the Shokaku of the 5th Carrier Division. Augmenting the carrier force were the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, the 2 heavy cruisers Tone and Chikuma, 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, and other vessels. On November 22, 1941, while United States-Japanese diplomatic talks were underway, the Nagumo force gathered at Hitokapu Bay on Itorafu Island, in the southern part of the Kuril Arch. All commanding officers assembled for special meetings with Admiral Nagumo, who took special pains to outline his plans for the attack, which would be launched should negotiations fail. At this time, no definite date for the assault was set. The final disposition and schedule for battle, should there be any, would be determined by the outcome of the diplomatic maneuvers going on in the American capital. On November 26, according to plan, the warships and supporting vessels of the Nagumo force weighed anchor and slipped out of Hitokapu Bay. Under strict secrecy, the task force set sail for its position north of Hawaii, whence, should it prove necessary, the attack would be launched against Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto personally directed the sailing order to Admiral Nagumo. Even as the fleet made its way across the northern Pacific waters, the diplomatic negotiations in Washington foundered. The Japanese government felt that the worst possible international situation had resulted. On December 2, 1941, Admiral Yamamoto dispatched new orders to Admiral Nagumo. The date for the declaration of war is fixed for December 8th. Upon receipt of his combat orders, Admiral Nagumo ordered the carrier task force to increase speed and to prepare for battle. Early on the morning of December 8th, the attacking force reached its destination, approximately 200 nautical miles north of Oahu Island. At 1:30 a.m., Tokyo time, the first bombers roared off their carrier decks, bound for Pearl Harbor. At exactly 3:23 a.m., Tokyo time, on December 8th, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida of the Akagi, Supreme Air Commander of the Pearl Harbor Attack Air Groups, issued the following order to all his pilots in the air over or approaching Pearl Harbor. All aircraft immediately attack enemy positions. Commander Fuchida then sent a wireless report to Admiral Nagumo. We have succeeded in the surprise attack. These two wireless messages were the signals for raising the curtain of war all across the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. Immediately thereafter, Japanese air fleets launched their attacks against enemy installations over a front of thousands of miles. The fundamental rule of any air battle is to gain immediate control of the local air by eliminating the defensive activities of enemy fighter planes. This precept was rigidly adhered to in the Pearl Harbor attack. Under Commander Fuchida's control, Lieutenant Akira Sakamoto led 25 Type 99 (VAL) dive bombers of the first attacking wave in a screaming assault on Hoyle Air Base. Before the attack, Japanese intelligence had reported that Hoyle was the main center of American fighter plane operations in Hawaii. Lieutenant Sakamoto's mission was designed to eliminate fighter opposition before the American planes could leave the ground. Immediately behind Sakamoto's group came 26 dive bombers under the command of Lieutenant Commander Kakuichi Takahashi. Takahashi's planes swarmed over Hickam Airfield, which was reported to be the major heavy bomber base for the enemy Army Air Force. Simultaneously, a portion of the Takahashi attacking force was diverted for an attack against Ford Island. The latter was reported as a base for Navy carrier fighters, and Takahashi's attacking wave effectively shattered the enemy's fighter strength. While a few enemy planes managed to get off the ground, our attacking aerial forces were relatively free from enemy fighter opposition, and our fleet was now protected from an American aerial counterattack. As the dive bombers plunged from the sky, Commander Fuchida's level and torpedo bombers assaulted the enemy battleships anchored in the harbor. Under Commander Fuchida's direct control were 49 Type 97 carrier-based attack bombers. Coordinated with this bombing effort was the torpedo bombing assault of 40 Type 97 carrier-based attack bombers under the leadership of Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata. As the dive bombers, level bombers, and torpedo bombers carried out their attacks, Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya led 43 Zero fighters in a low-level strafing sweep, shooting up enemy anti-aircraft positions, ground installations, planes, and ships in the harbor. The Zeros intercepted and destroyed 4 enemy fighters, which had managed to leave the ground during the attack and which were attempting to disrupt the bombing operations. 1 hour and 15 minutes after the first attacking force ripped into the American naval bastion, the second wave of 170 aircraft under the command of Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki of the Zuikaku reached the attack position above Oahu. Commander Shimazaki's 54 level bombers pounded the enemy fighter and bomber air bases. Immediately afterward, Lieutenant Commander Takashige Agusa's 80 dive bombers plunged earthward and sent their missiles into the anchored battleships and other enemy warships. 36 Zero fighters led by Lieutenant Saburo Shindo in a combination strafing and airstrike mission swept the air clear of opposing enemy fighters and carried out strafing attacks against the air bases. By approximately 8:50 a.m., all our planes had completed their attacks and had returned to their respective aircraft carriers. Chief Flight Petty Officer Juzo Mori of the Soryu flew the second torpedo bomber in the attack led by Lieutenant Tsuyoshi Nagai. This is Juzo Mori's story. The assigned objectives of the Soryu torpedo bombers were the American battleships which we expected to find anchored along the wharf of the Oahu Naval Arsenal. We dropped in for our attack at high speed and low altitude, and, when I was almost in position to release my own torpedo, I realized that the enemy warship toward which I was headed was not a battleship at all, but a cruiser. My flight position was directly behind Lieutenant Nagai, and we flew directly over Oahu Island before descending for our attack. Lieutenant Nagai continued his torpedo run against the cruiser, despite our original plan to attack the enemy battleships. However, I did not expect to survive this attack, since I and all the other pilots anticipated heavy enemy resistance. If I were going to die, I thought, I wanted to know that I had torpedoed at least an American battleship. The attack of the Soryu's planes was met with intense anti-aircraft fire from the enemy fleet, since the bombing waves from the Akagi and the Kaga had already passed over. My bomber shook and vibrated from the impact of enemy machine gun bullets and shrapnel. Despite my intention of swinging away from the cruiser, now dead ahead of my plane, and attacking the group of battleships anchored near Ford Island, I was forced to fly directly forward into a murderous rain of anti-aircraft fire. Because of this and the surrounding topography, I flew directly over the enemy battleships along Ford Island, and then banked into a wide left turn. The anti-aircraft fire did not seem to affect the plane's performance, and I chose as my new objective a battleship anchored some distance from the main group of vessels which were at the moment undergoing torpedo attack from the Soryu's planes. The warship separated from the main enemy group appeared to be the only battleship yet undamaged. I swung low and put my plane into a satisfactory torpedoing position. It was imperative that my bombing approach be absolutely correct, as I had been warned that the harbour depth was no more than 34 feet. The slightest deviation in speed or height would send the released torpedo plunging into the sea bottom, or jumping above the water, and all our effort would go for naught. By this time I was hardly conscious of what I was doing. I was reacting from a habit instilled by long training, moving like an automaton. 3,000 feet, 2,500 feet, 2,000 feet. Suddenly the battleship appeared to have leapt forward directly in front of my speeding plane. It towered ahead of the bomber like a great mountain peak. "Prepare for release. Stand by. Release torpedo." All this time I was oblivious of the enemy's anti-aircraft fire and the distracting thunder of my plane's motor. I concentrated on nothing but the approach and the torpedo release. At the right moment I pulled back on the release with all my strength. The plane lurched and faltered as an anti-aircraft struck the wings and fuselage. My head snapped back, and I felt as though a heavy beam had struck against my head. But I've got it. A perfect release. And the plane is still flying. The torpedo will surely hit its target. The release was exact. At that instant I seemed to come to my senses and became aware of my position and of the flashing tracers and shells of the enemy's defensive batteries. After launching the torpedo, I flew directly over the enemy battleship and again swung into a wide circling turn. I crossed over the southern tip of Ford Island. To conceal the position of our carrier, as we had been instructed to do, I turned again and took a course due south, directly opposite the Soryu's true position, and pushed the plane to its maximum speed. Now that the attack was over, I was acutely conscious that the enemy anti-aircraft fire was bracketing and smashing into my bomber. The enemy shells appeared to be coming from all directions, and I was so frightened that before I left the target area, my clothes were soaking with perspiration. In another few moments the air was clear. The enemy shells had stopped. Thinking that now I had safely escaped and could return to the carrier, I began to turn to head back to the Soryu. Suddenly there was an enemy plane directly in front of me. As my plane, the Type 97 carrier-based attack bomber, was armed only with a single rearward-firing 7.7mm machine gun, it was almost helpless in aerial combat. I thought that surely this time my end had come. As long as I was going to die, I reasoned, I would take the enemy plane with me to my death. I swung the bomber over hard and headed directly for the enemy aircraft, the pilot of which appeared startled at my maneuver, and fled. Is this really, I questioned, what is called war? At the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese Naval Air Force had attained what was probably the world's highest rate of accuracy in level-bombing aircraft attacks, including the use of conventional aerial bombs and of aerial torpedoes. The credit for such outstanding accuracy of bomb and torpedo hits, as was dramatically illustrated at Pearl Harbor, as well as in the sea battle off Malaya 2 days later, belongs largely to Admiral Yamamoto. During the period 1939 to 1940, the accuracy of Japanese-level bombers was incredibly poor. It was so bad that it was doubtful whether one hit could be achieved when 3 or 4 groups of 9-plane formations released their bombs from a height of 10,000 feet against an evading battleship-sized target on the open sea. On the other hand, an attack by 3 dive bombers against the same type of objective almost always guaranteed at least one successful hit on target. High official circles were of the opinion that, for attacking warships, dive bombing and torpedoing were the preferred methods of attack. The feeling that level bombing should be eliminated entirely dominated the Navy's air power hierarchy. At this time, Admiral Yamamoto took an active hand in the development of bombing techniques. Recently made Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, he was a Vice Admiral then, Yamamoto firmly declared, "As long as I am the Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, I will not do away with level bombing. True, our level bombing accuracy at sea has been poor, but the reason for the poor ratio of bomb hits lies in the free, evasive movement of the target vessel. There is no reason compelling us to select only these difficult targets. At any rate, I hope that much further study and practice will be conducted hereafter." Admiral Yamamoto had also issued the order to pursue and destroy, either at the Singapore Naval Base or on the high seas, the British fleet which was, at the time of the Hawaiian operation, somewhere in the Malaya area. As will be related in later pages, our Naval Air Force in this theatre, under far greater operating difficulties and hazards than were encountered at Pearl Harbor, accomplished a mission no less vital than the Pearl Harbor attack. The fighters and bombers of the Nagumo force, which attacked Pearl Harbor, fought brilliantly and heroically. Within a very short space of time, they destroyed the major strength of the United States Pacific Fleet. In this operation, our losses consisted of 9 Zero fighters, 15 Type 99 carrier-based dive bombers, 5 Type 97 carrier-based attack bombers, and 55 officers and men. Among the casualties were Lieutenant Saburo Makino, group leader of the Kaga's dive bombers, and Lieutenant Fusata Oida, squadron leader of Zero fighters from the Soryu. Lieutenant Ida participated in the Pearl Harbor attack as the leader of the 3rd Covering Fighter Squadron, composed of 9 Zero fighters, which struck in the 2nd attacking wave. Near the Kaneohe airfield, his squadron, with the aid of accompanying fighter units, intercepted 5 or 6 enemy planes and quickly destroyed them all. They then strafed the airfield, shooting up all enemy aircraft in sight. Lieutenant J.G. Iyozo Fujita, who participated with Lieutenant Ida in the attack as the second section leader, relates what happened to Lieutenant Ida's plane during the assault. When our planes machine-gunned the airfield at Kaneohe, I looked for but failed to see any anti-aircraft guns on the field. Later, however, when all the fighters assembled their formations over the field, I noticed a white spray of gasoline shooting out from Lieutenant Ida's plane. There appeared to be no other damage to his fighter, and I assumed he would be able to return to the carrier. Such was not the case, however. Lieutenant Ida circled over the Kaneohe airfield until he was sure that all our fighters were assembled in formation. Then, and only then, he closed his cockpit canopy and began to descend toward the airfield. Suddenly, the Zero whipped over into an inverted position and dove vertically for the enemy positions below. Thinking that he was going to make another strafing run on the field, I immediately began a wing-over to follow his plane down. I realized abruptly, however, that Lieutenant Ida was flying in a most unusual manner, quite different from his usual tactics. I watched his plane as it dove in its vertical, inverted position until it exploded on the ground between the Kaneohe airfield hangars. Thus died one of Japan's leading fighter pilots on the first day of the war. Lieutenant Ida had flown as a Zero fighter pilot since September of 1939 and had fought successfully against Chinese fighters over the Asiatic mainland. He was 27 years old when he died, and was the highest-ranking officer among the Nagumo Force's fighter pilots to die to this day. After the war, I, Okumiya, had the opportunity to carefully review the American photographs of the Pearl Harbor attack. In one picture, I saw the funeral ceremony at Pearl Harbor of an Air Force lieutenant of the Japanese Navy. It was not possible to discern from the photographs any difference in the burial services afforded the American dead and those given to the Japanese lieutenant. I point this out especially, since those Americans were killed because of a Japanese air attack in which this Japanese lieutenant participated. We, all former Japanese airmen, should take heed of this fact, and long remember the attitude of the American officers and men who did not make any discrimination between their own and the enemy's officers, even after such an event as the Pearl Harbor attack. Following the final assault against the enemy installations at Hawaii, Commander Fuchida, the Supreme Air Commander of the operation, returned safely to his aircraft carrier with the second attack force. Lieutenant Masaharu Suganami, group leader of the Soryuz Zero fighters, left his carrier at 1:30 a.m. when the Japanese fleet was still 200 nautical miles north of Oahu. After convoying the bombers of the first attacking wave and strafing the enemy's airfield, he remained alone over Oahu Island and joined the second attack group in its assault. He returned to his carrier at approximately 8:30 a.m. From such incidents, we can well appreciate the high quality and air combat superiority of the officers and men of the Nagumo force. This was their first introduction to air-sea combat on a large scale, and the men and planes accomplished their tasks magnificently. Thus ended successfully the greatest aerial operation ever seen up to this time. In a single smashing blow, a total of 353 planes from 6 aircraft carriers completely wrecked the powerful battleship fleet of the United States. This feat astounded the entire world. Who would have thought up to this time that the Japanese Navy, without firing a single shot from its guns, would be able to destroy almost completely, and within such a short time, the powerful dreadnoughts of the United States Pacific Fleet? The battleship had long been regarded as the king of the sea. Ever since the birth of the modern Navy, the battleship had reigned supreme in America's fleet. And this same fleet, which, with only 8 battleships, had been holding the Japanese Navy at a distance of more than 3,000 nautical miles, now lay crushed and useless as the result of a single telling air blow. What is most amazing about the Hawaiian operation is that of the 353 planes launched by the Nagumo force to attack Pearl Harbor, only 154 planes were assigned to attack the American warships. The remaining 199 aircraft were dispatched to strafe and bomb the enemy airfields, to destroy on the ground and in the air any enemy aircraft, to the end that the attacking Japanese force might have undisputed local air superiority. If the American Air Force had detected in advance the approach of the Japanese fighters and bombers and had thrown up an air defense of fighter planes, our accomplishments would surely have been lessened and our losses increased. It is conceivable that, had Pearl Harbor been protected by air defenses, the assault against Hawaii could have lost much of its effectiveness and the nature of the Pacific War proportionally altered. Zero fighters assure victories. Operations in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. The nature of the Hawaiian operation prevented the Zero fighters from demonstrating fully their exceptional combat performance. Our planes so quickly eliminated all enemy aerial opposition that the Zeros confined their sweeps mainly to strafing attacks. In the Philippine Islands and the Dutch East Indies campaigns, however, our success rested directly on the ability of the Zero fighters to establish control of the air. Neither campaign could possibly have achieved its success with a fighter plane of lesser performance than the new Zero, which so completely surprised the enemy. Our main land-based air strength lay in Formosa, to which our planes flew immediately prior to the war. Separating these bombers and fighters from crucial Clark and Iber fields on Luzon was the impressive distance of more than 450 nautical miles. We considered these two bases, as well as the city of Manila, which lay some 500 nautical miles from Formosa, as targets of the highest priority.